The horns blew and the ground shook. For 6 days, the people of Jericho had watched in confusion as Israelite soldiers marched silently around their walls, circling the city once each day with nothing but the eerie blast of rams' horns to break the quiet. Children peeked from behind shuttered doors, women whispered from rooftops, and soldiers peered down nervously from the battlements. On the 7th morning, it was different. The Israelites rose early, gathering before the sun had burned the mist from the plains. This time, they circled not once, but 7 times, their sandals pounding the dirt, their priests blowing horns until the sound pierced the air like a knife. Then came the shout, tens of thousands of voices rising in unison. The walls that had stood for generations, walls Jericho believed were unbreakable, began to crack. Stones tumbled, towers collapsed, and in moments, the fortress city fell open to its enemies. What followed was not just a battle, but a massacre that would be remembered in scripture and history alike. To understand what happened that day, you have to look at who the Israelites were and why Jericho stood in their path. For 40 years they had wandered the wilderness, a nation without a home, descendants of slaves who had fled Egypt under Moses. Now, under Joshua, their new leader, they had crossed the Jordan River and entered Canaan, the land they believed had been promised to them by God. But Canaan was not empty. It was dotted with fortified cities, and Jericho was one of the strongest. Built near the Jordan, Jericho's massive stone walls rose like a fortress above the plains. Archaeologists believe its fortifications were double-layered, with an inner wall and an outer wall, making it nearly impossible to breach with the weapons of the age. To the Israelites, Jericho was the first and most crucial test of their conquest. The siege itself was unlike anything the Canaanites had ever seen. Traditional warfare of the era meant battering rams, scaling ladders, or long starvation blockades. But Joshua claimed to follow direct orders from God. Those orders were unconventional. March around the city once a day for 6 days with the Ark of the Covenant at the center, priests blowing horns, and the people otherwise silent. On the 7th day, march 7 times, then shout. It sounded more like ritual than battle strategy, yet the Israelites obeyed. Inside Jericho, tension grew. Each morning, the strange procession appeared, encircling the city and then disappearing back into camp without striking a blow. Fear gnawed at the defenders. Every night, they wondered if the next sunrise would bring an attack. By the 7th day, nerves were frayed and hearts were heavy. When the walls collapsed, it was not a slow breach. It was sudden and devastating. The Israelites surged through the rubble, swords drawn. The defenders were overwhelmed almost instantly. What followed was not a fight for control, but a slaughter. Every man, woman, and child within Jericho was put to the sword, sparing none except Rahab, the prostitute who had hidden Israelite spies weeks earlier. Her home, marked with a red cord, was left untouched while the rest of the city was consumed by violence and fire. The Israelites set flame to Jericho, reducing it to ashes, its once mighty walls left as rubble. The destruction was total, meant not only to eliminate resistance, but to send a message to every city in Canaan of what was coming. The fall of Jericho was framed by Joshua and the Israelites as divine justice. They believed God had commanded not only the destruction of the city, but the extermination of its people as part of a larger judgment on the Canaanites. The practice of harem, or devotion to destruction, meant that nothing was to be spared, not people, not livestock, not even valuable goods. The gold, silver, and bronze were collected and dedicated to the treasury of the Lord, but everything else was destroyed. To modern eyes, it reads as a brutal act of total war, one that blurred the line between religious devotion and massacre. For the Israelites, it was obedience to a command they dared not question. In the aftermath, Jericho became a symbol. To Israel, it was proof that their God fought for them, tearing down walls and delivering enemies into their hands. To their enemies, it was a warning. Word spread quickly across Canaan of the city that fell without a fight, of walls that crumbled at the sound of horns and a shout, of a people who claimed their God demanded annihilation. Terror preceded the Israelites wherever they went next, softening resistance before the next battle even began. For Joshua and his army, the fall of Jericho marked the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. More cities would follow, each subdued in turn, though not always as swiftly or decisively. But Jericho stood apart because it was first, and because of the sheer scale of its destruction. The city was left in ruins, cursed by Joshua, who declared that anyone who tried to rebuild it would suffer grave consequences. Generations later, that curse was remembered when men attempted to restore the city and faced tragedy as a result. The rubble of Jericho became both a monument to destruction and a testimony of fear. The story of Jericho, recorded in the book of Joshua, has echoed for millennia not only as a tale of military victory, but as a moral and theological dilemma. To the faithful, it stands as evidence of God's power and faithfulness to his promises. To critics, it raises questions about violence carried out in the name of God, about innocent lives swept away in the wake of conquest. However it is read, the facts of the narrative remain stark. A city was leveled, its people wiped out, its memory enshrined as the opening chapter of Israel's claim to a new land. Archaeologists have debated the physical evidence, excavating the site of ancient Jericho and uncovering collapsed walls and layers of destruction. Some argue it matches the biblical timeline, others dispute the dating, but all agree that Jericho is one of the world's oldest fortified cities and that it did suffer violent destruction at multiple points in history. The debate over when and how only deepens the fascination with the story. Whether seen through the lens of faith or history, the fall of Jericho represents the meeting of human warfare and divine command in one of the Bible's most dramatic accounts. In the end, the fall of Jericho remains as chilling as it is legendary. It was not only the end of a city, but the beginning of an era of conquest defined by blood, fire, and faith. The people who lived behind those walls never imagined they would crumble in an instant, nor that their city would be erased in a single day. Yet the story endures, a reminder of the cost of war and the uncompromising demands of belief. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.